Good morning, everybody. It's the most wonderful time of the year. Everybody, I don't know the rest of the words this song. That was frightening, even to me. But it is a wonderful time of year, and especially for those of us who know what we're celebrating, that we're celebrating God with us, God coming to earth to show us His way, to teach us His truth, and to show us to give us new life. And so it's a great time of celebration. It's also, of course, a stressful time for our culture, and so we try and squeeze more activities into less time. There's the whole gift buying and gift giving thing that can stress folks out. Places seem to be more crowded. The streets are more crowded, the stores, the restaurants, and all of that can be stressful for folks. Also, for some folks, the season stirs up some negative feelings, and so that just kind of adds to the stress as well and can sometimes rob you of your joy of this great holiday season. One of those negative feelings that we need to let go, that I want to talk about with you this morning, is, I just forgot. Bitterness. There it is. Bitterness. We have, sometimes, Christians have gone through experiences, you have gone through experiences of hurt and disappointment and resentment that really get stirred to the surface, particularly for some at this time of the year. And these resentments and hurts can be years or even decades old. And so I want to talk about letting go of bitterness as we go through this season, because the good news is that Christmas points us to a way of letting go of that bitterness that hinders us and robs us of our joy. So let me tell you briefly how we got to bitterness as part of this series. Back in the spring, I believe it was, the preaching team was meeting and we were talking about the Advent series and this idea of letting go, and talking about different characters in the story, and we got talking about Joseph. Now, we don't know a lot about Jesus' stepdad, Joseph, but we've got some hints about who he was, right? He was a carpenter. He was in the town of Nazareth. He was betrothed to, in our language, engaged to be married to a young woman named Mary. And Mary had an angel, Gabriel, who appeared to her and told her that she would give birth to the Messiah and that her pregnancy would be the result of a miracle, not human relations. When Joseph heard this, being an honorable guy, he decided that he would leave her quietly. He wouldn't make a big deal and publicly humiliate her and so forth, that he would end the relationship quietly and go off on the rest of his life. But Gabriel then appeared to Joseph and affirmed the story that Mary had told him about what was going to happen. And so Joseph stayed with Mary. Now, Mary heard from an angel, and Joseph heard from an angel, but nobody else in town heard from an angel, right? So all the people in the town know is that Mary is pregnant, and she's not married, but engaged to Joseph. Now, in our society, that might be a bit of a scandal. In first century Palestine, that was a huge scandal. Like, this is beyond probably what we can even comprehend in terms of how people would react to them. And so Joseph and Mary now have to deal with people's scorn and judgment and righteous indignation over what they've done or what they perceive that they have done. And so as we talked about Joseph, we thought, what would it be like if Joseph had become bitter as a result of that experience? In the Gospels, we know that Mary got to do the whole run of Jesus' life and ministry on earth, and she saw it. Throughout the Gospels, we see that Mary was there. She was there to hear his teaching. She was there to witness miracles. She saw the crowds. She was at the foot of the cross when he died for our sin, and she was there when he was resurrected 3 days later. We don't know that about Joseph. The last we know of Joseph, Jesus was 12 years old. So we don't know how much of the rest of the story he got to experience. So what if Joseph had gotten bitter? What is the experience? What is the emotional state of bitterness? Bitterness is defined this way: angry, unhappy feelings caused by belief you have been treated unfairly and you are powerless to correct it. You've been treated unfairly. You believe that you've been treated unfairly. And as a result, you're angry, right? You're upset about that. And you carry these feelings around, and there's nothing you can do to change that. So imagine Joseph, right? Being ridiculed and so forth. There's nothing he can do. If he tells people the story, you can imagine their response, right? Like, you've got to be kidding me, Joe. That's what you come up with? Eye rolling, rejection, how dare you try to make this a spiritual kind of thing, and on and on and on. And that's how he had to go through life. Now, I don't know we don't know if Joseph became bitter. Probably not. But it's important to remember that the people in the Bible were human beings. They weren't different than we are. They weren't superhuman beings. They were men and women, boys and girls, just like us, with all of the same human foibles and struggles and so forth that we have. And how they tried to deal with that in their lives, in their communities, and with God. And bitterness is a reality within the human story. And so it's possible. Probably not, but it's possible that could have been part of Joseph's story. In an article I read on bitterness, a psychologist said that bitterness deepens as a person accumulates more and more of these negative feelings. So bitterness isn't static. It can deepen as we accumulate these various feelings, right? And so again, thinking about Joseph, he's going through his life, and every encounter he has where someone says something negative or reacts to him in a negative kind of way just reinforces. It's just another thing that he collects, accumulates, and it just deepens and deepens that sense of bitterness. So bitterness, if you think about it, it's like a root, right? And it can grow and it can deepen in the human soul. So bitterness is a root that bears bitter fruit. So what are some of the fruit that grow as a result of carrying around bitterness in our lives? And again, kind of looking at this from a psychological perspective and what psychologists say about bitterness, and they don't call it this, but the fruit of bitterness, they name things like this: a near constant state of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood, frequently irritated, quick to take offense, short-tempered, and the list goes on. As I was reading that list, I thought immediately of a guy who I counseled with many years ago here at Hope. When this guy showed up, he was a guy who was just kind of naturally irritable, right? And he did have a quick temper. And as I got to know him, he often talked about being unappreciated by people in his life and always misunderstood and taken for granted. He was quick-tempered as well. The whole reason he ended up here at Hope Church was because his previous pastor asked him to please leave their church, right? That was the spirit that he brought into the community of faith. His marriage was struggling. His adult kids kept their distance from him. And as he and I met and began to talk about his life and so forth, as we peeled away all of these layers, there was this constant theme of resentment and bitterness toward people in his life, all the way back to his youngest years. And he had been carrying these over the course of his lifetime. And now, before me, was the very definition of bitterness. Bitterness, friends, is so destructive to all of our relationships, your professional relationships, your personal relationships, your community of faith relationships. It's so destructive that the Apostle Paul addressed it in one of his letters to the churches. In his letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul spoke about bitterness. And I want to look at that with you. It's from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. Now give a listen. It says this, Paul writes, "Get rid of all bitterness." Now I want to pause there for a second, right? Get rid of all bitterness. Now, one of the things you need to know is that in the ancient Greek language, there was no punctuation, right? So there was no commas and periods and question marks and so forth. They had no punctuation. So any punctuation in the text was scholars who were putting that in as they're reading the text. And so as I'm reading this, and I see get rid of all bitterness, and then he goes on, what if instead of a comma after bitterness, it was a semicolon? And what Paul is saying is get rid of all bitterness, and then begins to list out aspects of bitterness. Because these are aspects of bitterness. So get rid of all bitterness, like rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all evil behavior. All of that may be from the root of bitterness. As we allow that to take root in our lives, all of these negative, destructive behaviors, like anger and rage and bad talk and so forth, grow out of that bitterness that we carry around. Instead, he says, so let go of that. Let go of the bitterness and all that comes with it. And instead, he says, or hold on to, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. Get rid of bitterness, he's saying. All bitterness. Because again, bitterness is like a root. And so if there is even a little bit of bitterness in us, it can begin to grow. And as other things happen, it just feeds into that bitter root. And so what may be small today can grow deeper as time goes on, as our lives go on. Now back to the Greek, because I love, doing the Greek thing. It was written in Greek, and I like you to know that I don't read Greek. That'd be a lie. When I was in seminary, we had to read the Gospel of, not the Gospel of John, 1 John, the first letter of 1 John. We had to read that in Greek. That's about as deep as my Greek goes. Anyway, I know how to research Greek. So the Greek word that is translated bitterness in older translations at times can be translated gall. Gall. And the word gall comes as a root word from the organ in the body, the gallbladder. And what the gallbladder does is it collects bile. Right? I've got some personal experience with gallbladders. Right? You may recall in the summer of 2022, I found myself in the fetal position on the floor of my bathroom in excruciating pain on a Saturday night. And finally, on Sunday at 4 o'clock in the morning, I had Marilyn take me to the hospital. Because up until then, I thought, I'm going to get better any second now, right? And what they found was that my gallbladder was all stopped up. That bile wasn't able to move out as it's supposed to. And so what was happening is the bile was leaching into my body and making me sick. Now, one of the problems I had was I'm on blood thinners because I've had blood clots, and so they couldn't do surgery for several days while my blood, I was getting off the blood thinners and my blood was, thickening up or whatever. So for days, this bile is leaching into my system. By the time they did the surgery, I was physically shaking uncontrollably. And they were throwing blankets on top of me, heated blankets. And with all of those blankets on top of me, I was still freezing and shaking. That's the impact of this bile leaching through my system. That's a great description of the gall, the bitterness, and what it does to us spiritually, what it does to our soul. The longer it's festering there, the more it spreads through your soul, spreads through your life, and makes you sicker and sicker in a spiritual sense. It's a nasty picture, right? So Paul says, get rid of all the bitterness, get rid of all of that gall, and instead hold on to grace. Really, what he's describing is grace. Instead of bitterness, with all of its attributes, hold on to grace. That is tenderheartedness, kindness, forgiveness. All of those come under the umbrella of grace. Grace isn't something we talk a lot about in our culture, but we know that grace is giving someone a gift that they do not deserve, right? That's what God has done for us. It's God's unearned or unmerited favor. It's a gift. His forgiveness is a gift. His kindness is a gift. Not because we deserve it, but because he chooses to give it to us. And so what Paul is saying is just as God in Christ forgave you and was kind to you, you should be that for the people in your life to whom you harbor bitterness and anger. Now, I know that there may be some of you who are thinking, yeah, there's only one problem with that. I don't wanna, right? And I get it. It is really hard to think about someone in your life or someone's in your life who have hurt you, who have disappointed you, and forgiving them and giving them kindness and tenderheartedness. So here's 2 reasons that you will want to do this. There's a whole lot of reasons to say why you don't wanna. Let me give you 2 reasons why you do want to, even though it's hard. And the first, Paul already talked about, that God, through Christ, did this for you. God did this for you. He gave you forgiveness. God gives you kindness. And if you're going to follow Jesus, and you're going to be a disciple of Jesus, as we talk about here, right? You're going to be in this process of conforming to the image of Christ, which is the best life to live. It's the way to the abundant life that he promises. Then we need to do this. Forgive everyone who has offended you. Right? The second reason is a bitter-free life is a better life. I mean, that's just the truth, right? A bitter-free life is a better life. Holding on to it does not give you a better life. Letting it go gives you a better life. After the gallbladder surgery, I want to get back to that story. I don't want you to leave me, have you laying on that bed with blankets, shivering and so forth. I did have the surgery. After I recovered and I saw the surgeon, I called her my hero because I found such relief. I experienced such relief having that infected gallbladder out of my system. But for the next 2 weeks, I had to have intravenous antibiotics every day pumped into my body to kill off the bile and its effect on my body, to kill off all of that infection, right? And each day, over the course of that 2 weeks, I felt a little bit better as those antibiotics killed off the effects of the bile in my system and restored me to health. And I went from being, at my worst, curled up in a ball in desperate pain to being healthy again. And that's, again, spiritually what goes on as we take these steps, right? Letting go of the bile of bitterness has a similar impact on your soul. Grace is the antibiotic of bitterness. So here's a few practical steps to help you let go of bitterness and embrace grace, all right? So here's some practical things that you can do today, starting today, going through this week, through this season, right? To kill off any bitterness that you may have. Now, you may not, again, just to be clear, you may not be a deeply bitter person. But all of us have to pay attention to the root of bitterness that may be in our soul. Okay? So this applies to everybody. Don't write this off as, man, I wish so-and-so were here for this. Woo! that dude really needs to hear this. He's the most bitter guy I know, right? That may be true, but you're here, right? And you're here for a reason, okay? So, some steps to embrace grace. First of all, silently name those with whom you are angry. Don't say it out loud. Don't, write it on a sticker and leave it on the window like we sometimes do, right? Who are those people? Who is that person or those people for you that you're angry at? Is that rain? Whew. All right. Again, for some of you that'll be obvious, and for some, it might come to you over time. And as God would have it, just to keep me humble in all of this, I'm preparing this message last week, and unrelated, I was in a conversation with a friend of mine, and we got talking about a situation that happened years ago, and as I was talking about it, I became aware of the fact that I still harbored anger at people in this story. I thought I had long since let that go and realized, oh no, there's still some anger there, right? So who are those people for you? And here's step 2, forgive them. Forgive them. Now you may say, I already have. And that may be true. That's great. But if thinking about them, when they come to mind, if you feel anger, right? If those negative feelings come up, then there's still some root there. And so you need to forgive them again and again and again and again, because forgiveness is a process, right? It's not just a one and done kind of thing. And this isn't about going to them and saying, I forgive you. This is about in your own mind and heart and soul saying, I forgive you. And what forgiveness ultimately is letting go of the hurt and anger that person caused you. It's not denying what they did or denying its impact on you. What you're doing, though, is saying, I release you from the pain that you caused me. I'm no longer holding you responsible for my pain, for my disappointment, for my resentment. I release you from all of that. And every time you forgive, you're cutting at that root of bitterness. The next step in grace after forgiveness, and these aren't, do one and then do the next. These can be happening at the same time. The next step in grace is to begin to think and act toward that person with kindness and love. Now, again, you may not be in relationship with this person, but when they come to mind and you've forgiven them, then to pray God's blessing on them. Right? Not God's blessing like, Lord, you ought to take them to heaven. Right? But God bless their lives. It's an incredibly kind thing to do, to pray for somebody in that way. If you can't do that, then you haven't really forgiven them. And so the work you're doing right now is forgiveness, okay? But if you're kind of moved on and you're able to come to that point of doing them a kindness, that's a great way to start. If this person is still in your life, right, and you see them somewhat regularly, There are simple acts of kindness that you can do. Right? It may be as simple as when you see them to wave and say, "Morning." Like right now, you couldn't do that, or you couldn't imagine doing that, so that's a step. Right? Now, I'm saying all this, I don't know your situation. I don't know who the people are that you're dealing with. I don't know the circumstances. You're going to have to wrestle with that and figure that out. And so what I would encourage you to do is, as you're thinking and going through this process, that you're also speaking to someone who brings wisdom and faith into their life experiences that can help you think through appropriate ways to act in kindness towards someone who has hurt you. The key for you is no longer acting from a place of bitterness, but rather from a place of grace. One last recommendation, then we'll close out. When it comes to the people with whom you are angry and hurt and harbor bitterness and so forth, as you think about them, ask yourself this important question: what does love require of me? Talked about this a number of times and will continue to, because it's a profound mindset to walk through life with. What does love require of me with regard to this person in this situation? So just real quickly, 1 Corinthians 13, because Paul had something to say about the nature of love at its deepest level, right? So he's writing another letter to another church, a church in Corinth. This first letter that he wrote, in the 13th chapter, he wrote these words: "Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude." And when we're carrying bitterness, all of those things can bubble to the surface, right? It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. That's what bitterness is about, keeping record of being wronged. Love doesn't act that way. It does not rejoice about injustice, but it rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Jesus said this: "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." That's old covenant teaching. But I tell you, new covenant, I tell you, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. But I don't want to, right? What does love require of me? What does it look like to conform to the image of Jesus Christ? It means acting in love, even to those who don't deserve it. It's the nature of grace. Our world, friends, is filled with bitterness, and the expression of bitterness in all of its anger and rage and filthy language toward others, all of its violence. And Jesus offers us a better way. When we choose to let go of bitterness and hold on to grace, we experience the life that God has in store for us. Let's stand together and pray. Let me give you just a moment to do a little business with God as you think about whoever that person or those people might be in your life, and offer forgiveness. God, as we think about and plan for Christmas, remind us it's not about the presents and the trees and the decorations as much as it is about the reminder that you loved us so much that you came to earth to show us a better way, to teach us an enduring truth that is life-giving. And for that, Lord, we celebrate and rejoice in this season, no matter what the other stresses may be. And Lord, thank you for your forgiveness for us, and help us, guide us, strengthen us, give us the wisdom to know how to offer forgiveness and grace to those in our lives as well. And we'll be sure to give you the thanks and the praise always and in all ways. And God's people agreed and said, amen. Hey, folks, have a great week.